I'm Father Columba Stewart, Executive Director of the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library, or as we call it, HMML. HMML is an international organization based out of Minnesota in the United States. Our work is solely funded by donations and grants. Our purpose is to preserve and share the world's handwritten past, to inspire a deeper understanding of our present and future. Handwritten books, manuscripts, are clues documenting what humans over thousands of years thought important enough to share. It is incredible what these voices from the past have to tell and teach us. Therefore, we photograph manuscripts around the world, so their contents can be available for centuries to come. We place a special priority on manuscripts located in regions endangered by war, political instability, or other threats. Preservation begins through partnerships with local libraries, agreements that allow HMML to make digital images of the manuscripts in their collections. Digitization is done entirely through local teams to whom we provide equipment, training, technical support, and payment for their work. We photograph everything in a collection because we don't know what might be significant in the future. Copies of the digital images are given to the repository that holds the manuscripts. Another copy comes to HMML in Minnesota. HMML employs catalogers and other staff to ensure that the digital images of these manuscripts are identified, supported for long-term access, and are made freely available to the public via our website. One of the many advantages that comes with doing the work that we do is that my team and I meet with extraordinary people from every corner of the world. We learn about their culture, their present experiences, and how they see the future. This series gives me the opportunity to introduce these extraordinary people and their stories to all of you, as well as to ask them questions I never had the chance to ask before. It is my belief, and it has been proven again and again throughout history, that when we truly listen to what others have to tell us, we build an understanding, and that is always a good foundation for collaboration. And of course, manuscripts and our written human knowledge are always at the heart of these encounters. Welcome. Thank you for joining us on this journey to listen. I hope you enjoy the conversation. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this third episode of Season 2 of To Listen, A Global Journey. My guest for this program is Corine Wegener of the Smithsonian Institution. Corey is the director of the Smithsonian Cultural Rescue Initiative, and she'll be telling us a little bit today about how she got into that fascinating position, like many of us, through kind of unexpected pathways. I first met Corey sometime in the early 2000s when you were still working at the Minneapolis Institute of Art, which now we call MIA, just as we like to say the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library is HMML. And you kindly gave a presentation to our important donors and friends at a Millennium Club event, telling the story of your work in Iraq, which then was still, I think, fairly fresh. Had just happened, 2 or 3 years before. And then years later, after you were at the Smithsonian, we reconnected because of our shared interest in cultural heritage protection, and delighted to say that you've now joined HMML's board. So you're connected to HMML in all sorts of ways, even though the actual focus of your work is a bit different from what we do. You work a lot with monuments and art objects, although some very interesting manuscript work as well. And you do a lot of training of local teams for disaster response. And we tend to focus in a much narrower way on manuscripts. So it's complementary, and you help our viewers, I think, understand the broader context of what HMML does and why. So let's get there and learn a little bit about you and your background. And I just want to say at the outset that one of the interesting things about you, Corey, and that I find particularly striking, and I know that our viewers will as well, is the way your life has sort of had these two tracks. You were a member of the United States Army Reserve You had several deployments in that capacity. You had an early interest in the military, and then you were into art. And then those two connected with disaster response in war zones. So tell us a little bit about where you grew up and how you got initially interested in art in the military or military in the art, whichever order you want to talk about that. And then we'll talk a little bit about how they actually came together for you professionally.
My early childhood years were in Lexington, Missouri. Sort of my early experience with museums was at the Nelson Atkins Art Museum in Kansas City. I remember being fascinated by the ancient collections, even as just a really little kid, and looking at cuneiform, which I didn't know what it was at the time, and hieroglyphics and mummies and all that sort of thing. I always loved museums, but it wasn't my path, really. I studied political science and a little bit of law, and it wasn't until much later that I got involved in art history and museums as a profession. And I don't come from a military family. My grandfather served in World War II stateside. I was always fascinated by the military. We would watch John Wayne movies on Sundays, my grandpa and I, the Green Berets and such. And, so I had this sort of Hollywood view of World War II. But later on in the 80s, it seemed like a good path for me because I needed money to pay for college. It was the be all you can be, Cold War still era. And so I joined the Army Reserves early on. And that's kind of how I got into the Army Reserves. I was doing that a long time before I was an art historian. So,
but that seed had been planted in that museum. And I remember as a young kid, school trips to the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston. And of course, everybody loved the mummies. We spent, I think, the most time in that room. And my mother also was very interested in ancient Egypt. And I can remember she and I at one point building a model pyramid. It was some school thing, which gave her an excuse to get creative. So, lots of paper mache and sandpaper. Later, we had a replica of the Great Pyramid. So given that, you then get your commission as an officer and you have various deployments. And, as I looked at that list of the various deployments that you had and the roles you played, you sort of graduated from, what was it, ammunition officer was one of your first, ammunition control officer for Operation Desert Storm based in Germany, and then navigated through Guam and Bosnia, none of those things really having much to do with cultural heritage, right?
Yeah, not really. Not until I went to Iraq was I really able to serve in that capacity.
And when did you get the art history degree?
Gosh, 1998, 99.
Okay, so before Iraq. So you had this
before Iraq. Yeah.
And you were working already in the museum world, right?
Yeah, when I got deployed to Iraq, I was working at the Minneapolis Institute of Art in the decorative arts department there, and preparing to go on a deployment to Afghanistan, actually, with my unit, the civil affairs unit there in the Twin Cities. And all of a sudden, we were watching television those fateful days, watching the looting of the Iraq National Museum on TV. And so I kind of really started lobbying hard for changing my assignment, which is not very easy to do as a captain, to get the Army to change you being deployed from Afghanistan to Iraq. But I think with the terrible PR effect that the looting of the museum had, they were very anxious to get somebody there with some background in cultural heritage. And there were very few of us, very few monuments officers in the reserve at that time. So it was basically me and another guy who was an archaeologist that we went. He was already in place, and then I got deployed to join them in progress just a few weeks later.
Okay, so you show up in Baghdad. This is 2003 still?
2003.
So really right after Iraq had been captured. So what'd you find? You get off a plane, and what did they drop you in?
Well, it was a really terrible situation for our Iraqi colleagues at the museum. They were devastated by the looting of the museum. Many of them had not been working at the museum in a long time. The museum was not open to the public for years and years because of the sanctions, UN sanctions. The museum was devastated. It was a mess. What the looters didn't steal, they were trying to smash in many cases. But the good news was that we learned pretty quickly after the looting that the staff had been able to hide some of the most important collections in the days leading up to the museum. And I should say that that's one of my first lessons in how to prepare for the possibility of an armed conflict was looking at the example of my Iraqi colleagues and looking at the example of what happened in World War II with so many museum colleagues in Europe trying to, take care of their collections by hiding them. Mm-hmm. And so, but the staff was devastated, and we set out to try and make sure people got paid, to try to get, document what happened, get things stabilized. And it wasn't easy because there weren't a lot of resources available.
I can believe it. I remember you telling us at that Millennium Club event of the unexpected encounter with Iraqi Jewish materials that were in the headquarters of the secret police in Muhawarat, and how they came to your attention and what you did with them. Could you say a little about why they were there in the first place, instead of being in a museum or a Jewish archive or wherever you might expect to find them?
The Iraqi Jewish community had been really devastated by the rise of fascism in Iraq in the sort of around the World War II period, going all the way, for decades. And most of the Jewish community in the whole country had been forcibly deported from Iraq, and often forced to leave their own belongings and, of course, the belongings of their synagogues. So this was a collection of material that had been confiscated from synagogues and placed in the secret headquarters. Basically, we're not sure why exactly. It was part of an intelligence gathering operation, maybe to try to track down people, but it was all kinds of information about the Jewish community of Baghdad. I learned about it in a New York Times story just as I was getting ready to leave Fort Bragg to actually deploy on to Baghdad, and saying that this cache of materials had been discovered in the flooded basement of this building, which had been hit by a big joint munitions bomb, a JDAM, that they were hoping to find some really important, documents, an important Talmud, etc. And I remember thinking, I'm so glad that's not my problem. My problem is going to be the museum. Well, I wasn't there but a few days when I learned about what the fate of that material had been salvaged and removed to another offsite location by an Iraqi political group. And they asked if I could come and look at it. The coalition came to my office, and of course you say yes. And I went to look at it, and it was really molding and, high temperatures. You've got this organic material, a lot of paper, a lot of books. We had to figure out a way to try and save it. And so my suggestion was to freeze it. Nobody believed me, so they called the National Archives and Records Administration, and they said, yes, what she said, freeze it. And so that's what we did. We found a freezer truck and got it loaded in and brought it to a secure storage in Baghdad.
So this was the summer in Baghdad.
Yes, very hot.
What's the temperature?
120 degrees a day during the day, pretty much, and then dipping down low at night. And these freezer trucks are meant for food, and that was part of the problem, is that the temperature would fluctuate wildly. And if you can keep something frozen in a kind of a stable temperature, that can work pretty well. But when it goes up and down like that, that's the most damaging. Mm-hmm. And so anyway, over those hot summer months, we were advocating for being able to take it somewhere where it could get freeze dried. And the problem is there was no facility like that in Iraq, nor even close by. I mean, we barely have very many freeze drying facilities in Washington, D.C., let alone they're just not everywhere. And so ultimately, the decision was made through an agreement with the Iraqi Ministry of Culture, who knew nothing of this material. It was not any part of their collection until it was discovered. They didn't know about it. And the coalition, and as part of that agreement, it would come to the United States for conservation at the National Archives and then be put on an exhibition. And that's what happened.
Okay, so it's still here.
Yeah. And I was lucky enough to get to be the courier for the material. We had to keep it frozen. which was the challenge, putting it on an airplane. And I thought, oh, just turn the heat off, you know, because you're
When you're in the air. Yeah.
you know. Well, it's more complicated than that, but we worked with wonderful Air Force people and colleagues at the Department of State and at DOD. And so the plan was to take it to Dallas, Fort Worth, where there's a really big commercial freeze drying facility there. Lots of museums use it. And we had to fly it to Kuwait. And then right away, we got grounded because our flight crew hadn't had enough crew rest. And so, you know, at every step, we had to find a power source to keep this freezer container with these archaeological crates full of wet material frozen throughout this trip to the United States. And I love telling, if I could tell a quick story, when we got to Rota, Spain, the base there, we landed to change our crew again. And it was very hot there too. And I was like, okay, I'm going to have to find somebody. And I'd been given instructions by the Air Force, what you say when you land. I need to talk to the commander of the flight line, blah, blah. Stuff Army people wouldn't know. Luckily, I was a major, so I at least had something going for me. And I demanded to see the commander of the flight line and all this. So this guy comes and I'm getting ready for a fight because, you know, I know he's going to say, what the heck are you talking about? Blah, blah. And because it wasn't exactly a secret mission, but it was a mission. And I looked up and this young lieutenant, Navy lieutenant, was wearing a yarmulke. I just couldn't believe it. I could not believe it. And I said, well, he said, what do you got in there, ma'am? Frozen human hearts or something? He exactly said that. And I said, no, but what I have in there, Lieutenant, is what's left of the Jewish heritage of Iraq, and I really need your help.
Wow. That brings tears to my eyes.
Me too. Every time I say it, and I must have told this story 100 times. And so anyway, he got an electrician out there because we had, you know, the wrong power cord, as one does when you're flying from, just like when you're flying with your own stuff, you have the wrong outlet thing. Anyway, they got it all hooked up and I had just, you know, got it on a generator. I had enough time to have a real hamburger for the first time in months at the cafe. And then we were flying again and we landed in Dallas, Fort Worth and got it immediately into a freeze dryer. And I handed it to my colleagues from NARA and said, this is your baby now. I have to fly back to Iraq now. So
that's amazing. And then it went on display. There was,
yes, after it needed a lot of conservation. It took literally years. Money had to be raised, etc. But the conservators did a fantastic job. And it opened, I can't remember what year now, but it opened at the National Archives and Records Administration in Washington, D.C. And then the small exhibition has been traveling around to other NARA locations around in the United States.
I don't know if I ever told you before, but a few years ago, I was in Cambridge, England for a conference. And it was on endangered cultural heritage, a lot of emphasis on Iraq. And there was a student at Cambridge who was going to some of it. And his father came up from London. And it turned out that his father, whose name was Edwin Shuker, was basically the head of the Iraqi Jewish community in Britain. And he told us the story of how his family escaped. And it was a bit of cloak and dagger. They stayed on in Iraq a bit longer than some had. So getting out was very difficult. And they eventually made it from Baghdad up into Turkey, sort of crossing the mountains. But in any event, what he was telling us was the story of going to this exhibition. And he said he had heard about this rescue. And of course, I knew the story from you. But what he told us was he went to, I don't know if it was at NARA, it was some big opening. So maybe it was the original full exhibition. And they're walking around and talking about all this. And he looks in a display case and he sees his own report card. So from grade school, his report card. And this had been, you know, sort of chosen as an example of daily life in the Jewish community, which of course then was completely devastated. So it all sort of circles back and connects.
I've been to 3 of the exhibition openings, and each time I meet Iraqi Americans who can point to something in there saying, oh, in that photo, that's my grandfather, or, this letter from my father to the rabbi, or what have you. It's really an amazing experience. And people came from far and wide to be able to be a part of that and to see their own heritage on display.
So you come back after that experience, and I know you had a sort of keener sense of the importance of this work, for the military broadly. Were there already policies in place for the United States military for dealing with cultural heritage and protecting monuments and so on?
Mhm. Yeah, the doctrine that requires the protection of cultural property during wartime goes all the way back to the 1954 Hague Convention to protect cultural property in armed conflict. But, even during World War II, in 1943, the Civil Affairs Division was created to work with the civilian communities as the occupying forces came in, as we won the war. They knew they needed a plan. Occupying whole countries requires military government. And so this was the Civil Affairs Division of Military Government. And as part of what they needed to do, they knew they would need to work to protect the cultural heritage sites, because that's often a government responsibility in most countries,
sure.
right? You have a Ministry of Culture. And so that's where the World War II monuments men and women, or that's the kind of colloquial nickname, but it was the Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives teams of World War II, which were a lot of Americans, and then also Allied nations had their own version of that that worked together. I realized, though, quickly when I got to Iraq, working with such a large coalition of different nations and knowing our role in the US, we had never ratified the 1954 Hague Convention, even though the US government was very involved in drafting it in The Hague in 1954. And we didn't ratify it because we were in the throes of the Cold War. And apparently the DoD didn't think it was a good idea. And so we never ratified it. And I realized quickly that a lot of our allies were really pretty peeved about the looting of the Iraq Museum. And in fact, it caused no small amount of upset of governments that really do value cultural heritage as very important. And it was a sore spot within the coalition in some cases. It was a sore spot in my office, I can tell you that. My Italian colleagues thought, wow, I was literally told by one of my carabinieri military police folks who have the job of protecting heritage in Italy, that of course the United States let the Iraq Museum get looted, because everybody knows we don't really care about culture because we've never ratified the Hague Convention. I thought, well, you know what? I'm going to have to prove you wrong. And so anyway, when I got back to the US, I worked with a number of groups to figure out how the United States could have a Blue Shield National Committee. And I need to say what the Blue Shield is. The Blue Shield is an international organization that was created back in the 90s after the damage and destruction to heritage in Bosnia during that conflict, to support and help implement the 1954 Hague Convention. The convention was the first ever law of war treaty, specifically just to protect cultural heritage in armed conflicts. And it has several things that each country is supposed to do. And one of the big rules is that you're supposed to teach your military about protecting heritage. And we weren't doing a very great job at that. We had very few monuments officers like myself, and we had a lot more units that were deploying around the world. And so we created the US Committee of the Blue Shield, part of the International Blue Shield movement. There's also a Blue Shield International organization. It's kind of like the Red Cross, but for culture. The Blue Shield is to the Hague Convention what the Red Cross is to the Geneva Conventions. We set out to try and help train soldiers who are getting ready to deploy about the very important cultural heritage in places like Iraq and Afghanistan and all the different places where the US military was going. And so that was my goal. As soon as I got back, I had to go back to my job, but they were very supportive and during my deployment and in this effort. And we were also very heavily supported by two wonderful women, Nina Archibald, who was then director of the Minnesota Historical Society, and Lyndall King, who was then director of the Weissman Art Museum. And they were very influential in the leadership of the American Alliance of Museums. And to create a Blue Shield committee, you need the You need a signed letter from your museums association and from your archives association. These professional organizations helped create the Blue Shield movement. And so they were really instrumental in helping us get started, because once we had the museums behind us, all those other organizations fell into place and realized how important this really was.
That's exciting. Well, of course, Nina and Lyndall have been a dynamic duo for HMML, serving on our board, and Lyndall chairing it now. That just shows what you can do for Minnesota, because you of course, were still in Minneapolis at that time, and we do our work out of Minnesota as well.
Yeah, I've heard it said, called the Minnesota Mafia for cultural heritage around in DC. So yeah, definitely we have a strong role to play, I think.
So Corey, you were involved in Iraq from 2003, and you've gone back in recent years, particularly after some of the devastation following the conquest of northern Iraq by ISIS or Daesh. And of course, HMML was working in Iraq before that period of 2014 to 17, and I had the chance to see some of the destruction you've been involved with. And notably in my memory is Nimrud, this astonishing old Assyrian site in northern Iraq with incredible carvings, which was completely devastated by ISIS. And even they produced a video of blowing it up with barrel bombs and then bulldozing the fragments. So tell us a little bit about what you did there and how that has been part of what you've been doing in recent years with training people about disaster response.
One of the things that I recognized right after Iraq was that we needed a better capability to help cultural institutions, collecting institutions who had experienced a disaster, because there really weren't a lot of people you could turn to say, what do we do now? How do we document this appropriately? How do we do salvage? Surely there's a handbook about this. Well, not much. And so I was lucky enough to, right after, actually during my time in Iraq, I met a woman named Aparna Tandon who later joined the International Conservation Center in Rome. And she's a conservator who was thinking the same way. How can we help colleagues who've been devastated by a major disaster think about how to do the recovery, the immediate disaster response, not the long-term recovery, not the prep, but the immediate. And so we created together a number of organizations, including the Prince Claus Fund, ICROM, the Smithsonian, the First Aid for Cultural Heritage and Crisis methodology. And it's really specifics about, situation analysis, how to do the immediate damage assessment, documentation, salvage, evacuating collections, and it's a step-by-step method. And I think this has been really revolutionary in helping people recover from disasters and to teach cultural heritage colleagues around the world that, there's a toolkit, there's a methodology, we can help you. And so we run many trainings over the years, international trainings. And so we applied that in Iraq. The Smithsonian's been involved in Iraq for a number of years to do training for Iraqi colleagues from around the country on site preservation, archaeological preservation, and conservation. And so the team working on the site of Nimrud from Nineveh province, from the Ministry of Culture, had received our training, and they applied that method at Nimrud. How do we take this terribly damaged site, divide it up into a grid system, almost like archaeology, but it's above the ground, and try to recover those sculpture fragments. I have to say, when you're thinking about the importance of heritage, think about the idea, I've been told by colleagues that Nimrud was the most visited cultural site in Iraq by Iraqis before it was devastated by ISIS. People would go, even if they weren't into the ancient Assyrian history or the Assyrian Christian history or any of these other things, they would take their families there for picnics. It was one of the most visited sites. And to see that devastation, and when we asked the Iraqi Ministry of Culture, how can we help you? What is your number one priority? Because it's everything, right? Without a doubt, they said Nimrud. So that's where we started.
Yeah, I remember visiting there in, I think it was May of 2017 with CBS News. They were able to get all the clearances and permissions and because you're sort of going from militia to militia to militia as you travel across northern Iraq, and this sort of pile of rubble taller than me of all of the stuff that they had blown up, and these winged figures, and all the beauty of Assyrian art. It was devastating. And meanwhile, we were trying to figure out what had happened to manuscript heritage, collections that had disappeared, been sold, stuff found in the street, and then the heroic stories of how people got stuff out. They hid it. They took it to the mountains. They did what they had always done when they could see a threat coming. And of course, you've used the same technique in training in Haiti.
Yeah, that was kind of the incubator for the methodology, because we used it in Haiti in 2010 after the earthquake. Institution by institution, we tried to help people figure out how to do that salvage operation to try and prioritize and save what they could for rebuilding. We worked with the Episcopal Church there to save a very important series of wall paintings of the life of Christ that were devastated when the church collapsed, and we were able to save the Last Supper mural and put it in storage for future rebuilding of the church. So the methodology has developed a lot since then. We added some information about how to think about documenting a site that might have had criminal activity as part of the destruction, like the way Daesh destroyed Nimrud, and how they definitely destroyed many pieces and parts of the Mosul Cultural Museum. Mm-hmm. And we've been working with them. We did a documentation and stabilization mission in February 2019 as part of a project we're working on with Aleph and the Louvre Museum and the World Monuments Fund to do the revitalization of that museum. But first we had to document it in case that documentation could be used as future evidence for a criminal tribunal. So we've added that sort of aspect to our work so that we can help better support the Hague Convention. And hopefully, that's one of the ways that we can contribute to the greater knowledge of colleagues when they're confronted with that kind of terrible crime, that kind of damage against heritage.
That's a pretty cool career progression from ammunition control officer, I have to say. And maybe I could have my analogous unexpected career path. So Corey, you had this amazing experience in Iraq, sort of during the Iraq War and the rescue of things in Baghdad, and then the development of Blue Shield and so on. And then this thing happened at the Smithsonian. So how did you navigate from the Army work and rescuing those endangered objects to essentially kind of, I think, starting a new initiative of the Smithsonian?
Well, I was really lucky that the Minneapolis Institute of Art really supported me as an Army reservist the time I was away, including sending us conservation supplies and things like that. And so, I came back to my normal job and then decided that I really wanted to start Blue Shield, and everybody was very supportive with that. And then we were riding pretty high on the fact that the US Senate had ratified the Hague Convention in 2008, 2009. And then in early 2010, we were devastated to witness the terrible earthquake in Haiti. And so often Blue Shield national committees do disaster outreach to our colleagues in neighboring countries. And the US committee had not really been focused on that and realized that we were probably the closest neighboring national committee of the Blue Shield to Haiti, being an hour flight from Florida. Sure. And so we started looking at, basically my theory of everything is if you don't know what to do, have a meeting of a bunch of smart people and hope that somebody has a good idea. And so at the time, I wanted to have it at the American Alliance of Museums headquarters in Washington, D.C. And Ford Bell from Minnesota was actually the head of AAM at the time. And he and his staff managed to invite quite a few people to this meeting about Haiti, including Dr. Richard Curran from the Smithsonian. And I remember Ford Bell telling me, "You'll like this guy, he gets things done." And so that was so true. And we launched the Haiti Cultural Recovery Project. And the Smithsonian had a long history of a relationship with Haiti, going back to the Folklife Festival in the early 2000s. And so colleagues from Haiti were reaching out to the Smithsonian saying, we need help. Our museum collections are at risk. These museums are damaged. How can you help? And so, the next thing I knew, I was getting a call from Richard Curran saying, I'm going to Haiti next week. Do you want to go? And so working on that project with him was really exciting. And about a year later, he said, we need to be able to do this better and faster. Would you consider coming to Washington to work at the Smithsonian? And I said, wow, I already have my dream job, curator at the Minneapolis Institute of Art, but it's too tempting to pass up. So I did.
No, that's great. And I know that you've been able to thereby gain a kind of platform as part of the kind of national conversation about cultural heritage. And then obviously that's an easier jumping off point for working with people around the world and getting involved in all these locations that you've told us about. So Corey, we ask all of our guests as they tell us the story of their involvement with the culture that they're either a member of or cultures that they've partnered with to preserve cultural heritage, almost always in very difficult circumstances, lots of human suffering, lots of economic devastation. When you do that kind of work, where is it that you, Corey, find hope?
Mostly I find hope in my colleagues who seek out learning about how to save cultural heritage and collections in disasters, and seeing how they take that knowledge and they carry it back with them and they teach others. And then when inevitably, and I've seen this happen with so many of our participants in our heritage training courses, where they are then faced with another disaster, because it's never, it's always when is the next one, not if there's going to be a next one. And that they take it and they run with it. And then it's not, oh, can you come to Haiti to help us? In this most recent earthquake that they had, it was, we've got this, but do you, if there's any, we'd like to work together. And we were able to provide a little bit of, satellite mapping and stuff, which they didn't have access to. And they're handling it. They needed some funding. Same with Iraqi colleagues, seeing them be able to go from getting some training to the work at the Mosul Museum. Those colleagues who were also working at Nimrud are also doing the, damage assessment and salvaging materials and conserving objects. And they're about to embark on full rehabilitation of that museum. They're able to save their own heritage. So that's what gives me hope, is having all these colleagues who you see that aha moment where they say, hey, I could do this myself. That's a wonderful.
That really is exciting. I mean, we know that disaster can happen anytime, and these are both places which had multiple repeated disasters. And just to know that they were ready for it when it happened. And I hate to say it, but it will happen again, likely in both of those places, as well as in places that we have no idea at this time. But that's what we certainly discovered with HMML's work, is we don't know where or when. So we try to get in before bad things may happen, but sometimes we're there as they're happening. And as you so often do, sometimes we're there trying to do the cleanup of whatever we can with what survived from collections. So let me ask you one final question. And that is, when somebody asks you, why bother? Why does cultural preservation matter? What do you tell them?
I do get that question a lot. It does matter because it's the beating heart of a community. And I often explain it to people from an individual micro level to the macro level. If you have a family who has a house fire, and as soon as the family's safe, and we see this with the Colorado wildfires and other places, people want to go back to their home and find that irreplaceable heritage that tells the story of their family, of their identity, of those who came before, so they can tell it to future generations. Well, it's the same way with whole communities and nations and ethnic groups, et cetera. You need the story of who you are. to help you survive a disaster and give you hope for the future so that you can tell the story of what happened there, whether it's war, whether it's a devastating flood or hurricane. You can tell that story to future generations.
I love that. So saying that cultural heritage is essential for even the survival of a community, much less its flourishing. It's not an add-on.
Right.
It's at the heart. And that image of the beating heart, I like that a lot. We often say with Himmel's work with manuscripts that what we're doing is sort of preserving and retrieving the voices of the ancestors, because otherwise we have no access to what people thought or said. It's only what they wrote down. And bringing that out can be not only of scholarly interest, I mean, I know it can be a scholarly interest, I get into that kind of stuff, but it also continues to speak to people who are part of those communities. And partnering with them obviously is a huge part of what we do. Well, I want to thank you, Corey, for this conversation. I'm going to think about a lot of what you said today. I love the beating heart. I love this idea that you've already seen the fruits of the work of training with people who were ready for it when it came. And it's always wonderful for me to hear somebody else's story, how they found themselves doing something which is not an obvious career goal, but obviously has brought tremendous reward and satisfaction to you. So I want to encourage our viewers to share the program with others by sharing the link to our YouTube channel that we'll be sending around after this premiere. And I'd also encourage those who are watching this to provide feedback with the online survey that we'll be sending after the program. And I'm not going to tell you what the next program in the series is going to be, because this is the last episode for season 2. And we'll be thinking about how things went this season and whether we're going to do some more of these next year, or maybe move into some different way of sharing stories related to listening from a global perspective. Thank you, Corey.
Thanks for having me.